Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and you're very welcome to join us here at our Halloween storytelling event, coming to you live from Stockholm, Uppsala, and Cork. With our apologies for the slight delay, we can blame the Halloween spirits who are messing in the background with our IT technology. But we're up and running and delighted to be here with you this evening. My name is Maeve Killen. I'm the Deputy Head of Mission here at the Embassy of Ireland in Stockholm, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. I won't stay too long, but I'll just introduce our panelists who we're very lucky to have with us. First up, we have Diarmuid O'Driscoll. Diarmuid is an author and storyteller. He's written books on local history, including the English Market in Cork and Beamish and Crawford's Brewery. And he's currently working on a 4-part documentary series with T.G. Cahir on the River Blackwater, which is set to air next year. Diarmuid has travelled around Ireland as a storyteller, and he's been involved with the Cape Clear International Storytelling Festival for over 20 years. And for those who don't know, Cape Clear is the southernmost inhabited Gaeltacht island, 3 miles long by 1 mile wide and 8 miles off the coast of West Cork. So as far as you can go down in the very southwest of the country. On the other hand, then we have Dr. Gregory Darwin, who is the new senior lecturer in Irish and Celtic Studies at Uppsala University here in Sweden. And we're delighted to welcome Greg here to join the Team Ireland team. And he's keeping the 70-year-long tradition of Celtic Studies at Uppsala University going and alive and well. So we're delighted to have him here. Tá Gaeilge Líofa Greg, he speaks fluent Irish, although he hails from Canada, which is very impressive. And he completed his PhD in Celtic language, literatures and linguistics at Harvard University in 2019 with a focus on Irish folklore. So as you can tell, we're in excellent hands this evening as we learn a little bit about Irish folklore and enjoy a few stories as well. So we'll first hear a little overview of Irish folklore traditions from Greg, and we'll hand over to Diarmuid then for the first story of the evening. You should see a Slido box on the right-hand side of your screen, so we'd love to hear from you and where you're joining us from this evening. And we hope to have a few minutes at the end for some questions, so feel free to drop them in as well. So I'll hand over to Greg now to get going, and all I can say is taxi at Mucke, gur míle mágwibh.
Gur míle lad, Maeve, as an gur láthar agus as an gura. The communal telling of stories, is a practice common to all cultures and probably one as old as behaviorally modern humans themselves. There's something fundamental to the way that we think that encourages us to make sense and meaning of the world that we encounter through narrative. And it's easy to imagine our distant ancestors huddled around a fire somewhere exchanging tales of the hunt, their narrow brushes with death, or the exploits of ancestors that grew embellished with every telling. Beyond the simple act of spinning a yarn, several of the stories that we know today have histories which extend into the depths of time. While most people are familiar with Cinderella, for example, from the version as presented by Walt Disney, we find a version of the story roughly 2,000 years previously in the works of the Greek historian Strabo, where the glass slipper has been replaced with a more, perhaps climate-appropriate papyrus sandal. And there's indeed further reason to think that many other of our canonical fairy tales have pedigrees that similarly stretch back thousands of years. As many of you know or can no doubt infer from the title and nature of this event, storytelling is an especially significant affair in Irish culture. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, before the widespread introduction of electrical power, and with it new forms of entertainment and communication such as the radio and television, the Teach Céilí or Teach Arnon, the Céilí house, was a fixture of Irish rural life. Guests would come for a cup of tea, or perhaps something stronger, to exchange news and gossip, to sing, to play music, to dance and to tell stories, at times very long and very elaborate stories, up until the small hours of the morning. While not as ubiquitous as it once was, as they once were, these customs persist to some extent, and the ongoing importance of stories and storytelling can be seen in other ways. In the Irish language, one way of greeting someone is to ask, Ein scéal, do you have any news, or do you have any story to tell me? And if you spend any amount of time in rural Ireland, it's not hard to find people who might be described as seanchaí, people with a particular interest in local traditions and history, who are often keen to share this knowledge. Speaking from personal experience, you can learn a lot during a casual chat over a cup of tea or in the passenger seat, talking to a stranger who's offered you a lift to the train station. The longer stories, the Scialta Fada, are still told and retold in a range of settings, although nowadays we are as likely to encounter them from recordings and printed sources, thanks to the invaluable work of the Irish Folklore Collection, as we are directly from oral tradition, Béilgeas. Evidence for stories and storytelling in Ireland goes back several centuries, as Ireland can claim to have one of the earliest vernacular literatures in Europe. One prominent figure in medieval Irish society was the file, or the poet. His main responsibility, and it was usually a he, is what we might now called propaganda, increasing the reputation of local and provincial rulers through poems of praise, as well as keeping them in line with satire or the threat of satire. In addition to the business of poetry and public relations, Feicfidh were expected to be at least somewhat familiar with the storyteller's art. A list of tales which every Feicfidh was expected to know and presumably be able to tell survives in two distinct versions in several manuscripts, the oldest of which is the Book of Leinster, written around the end of the 12th century. Some titles in these lists belong to stories that are well known to us now: the cattle raid of Cooley, the wooing of Aideen, the death of Cuchulainn, while others are far more obscure, and some represent the titles of tales that are now lost to us. I'm going to talk briefly about one of these stories, known as Eachtra Nera, the Adventure of Nera, since it shows us that some of these attitudes and beliefs regarding this time of year in Ireland are in fact many centuries old. The tale begins on Samhain night, when Medb and Ailill, the Queen and King of Connacht, were holding a feast at the royal palace at Rathcruachan. Ailill issues a challenge to his warriors and offers a golden-hilted sword to anyone brave enough to tie a withy, a flexible branch of willow or some other tree, around the foot of one of the dead men hanging on the gibbet just outside the palace. Many try, but are terrified by the darkness and the demons that roam about at night. And only Nera is brave enough to reach the gallows. He tries 3 times, and on the 3rd time, at the advice of the dead man, is able to secure the withy with a pin. The dead man asks Nera to carry him around until he gets a drink of water, and Nera, not wanting to be impolite, obliges. So first they come to a house surrounded by a lake of fire, where the hearth has been properly raked and tended to. This won't do. Next, they come to a house surrounded by a lake of water, and where the inhabitants have tossed out all the water in every single trough and vessel outdoors before going to bed. Again, this won't do. And the 3rd house they come to, it's always the 3rd, is unobstructed, and so they enter. After he takes his drink, the dead man spits the dregs out over the sleeping inhabitants of the house and killing them all. And the scribe here takes a moment to connect this to superstitions about proper housekeeping, superstitions which we find mentioned in legends collected in Ireland and Scotland in the 20th century. Nera then takes the dead man back to the gallows and returns to find Rathcruachan in flames, her inhabitants all dead, and a heap of severed heads piled up outside the feasting hall. Nera follows the attackers into the sheath, the mound, or the hill, where the people known as the Dina Maha, the fair folk, or the Dina Ushla, the gentry, are said to dwell. He is made there to serve in the court of the king of the sheath, and after spending what to him seems like most of a year there, during which he marries and has a child of his own, he learns the destruction that he saw, the destruction of Rathcruachan, was just a vision of what was to come unless his own people were warned. Next year, Nera returns to Rathcruachan, bringing with him summer fruits as proof of his adventure, and he finds that while he experienced most of a year, only a few days had passed in our own world. The following Samhain, when the sheath is open again, Medb and Ailill planned an assault, but were hindered when Nera could not evacuate his new family from the sheath in time. And so when Samhain comes again the following year, they attack, the people of Connacht attack and plunder the sheath, taking many wondrous treasures with them. Samhain, along with Beltana, marks a halfway point in the traditional Gaelic calendar, dividing the year into its light and dark halves. The festival of Samhain might have been significant for the ancient Celts. The Kuligni Calendar, a bronze Gaulish calendar from the 2nd century AD, found in modern-day France near the border with Switzerland, a few hours drive from Genova, includes a month that they refer to as Samonios, which looks an awful lot like our Samhain, although it apparently there refers to the month of May rather than that of November. Whatever form this celebration might have taken in prehistory, by the Middle Ages the feast was inextricably attached to the Christian season of Hallowtide, marked by prayers of remembrance for the saints and for the dead. Like Dia de Muertos celebrated in Mexico, it represents a synthesis of Catholic and indigenous traditions. It's a perilous time of year, when the nights grow longer and colder, the dead are wont to wander around, and the sheath are open, so that one might encounter all manner of strange beings. It's also a time for visions and portents, and for attempts to tell the future, perhaps by baking a ring or a coin into a barmbrack to see who might marry in the coming year. Some of you will no doubt be more familiar with Samhain under its more modern guise of Halloween, originally a contraction of All Hallows Even, the night before the Catholic Feast of All Saints. The 19th and 20th centuries saw large numbers of Irish immigrants to the United States and to Canada, and they brought with them their customs and their festivals. Some elements of the celebration evolved over time in order to fit the new context. Bonfires were not as practical in urban settings where many Irish settled. Guising developed into costume parties and trick-or-treating, and turnip lanterns evolved into the more familiar pumpkin jack-o'-lantern, a change which anyone who's tried to carve a turnip by hand can no doubt appreciate. The core meanings of the celebration, however, have been stable, and the macabre and the perilous is never far away at this time of year. Samhain, as I mentioned, marks the beginning of the dark half of the year, when the nights become long and cold. Ohawan Gebeltana, from Samhain to Beltana, is traditionally the time for telling stories. We may now be a few days too early, but I'm sure no one will mind if I turn things over to Diarmuid so he can start us off with a tale or two.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, I want to tell you about a man called Gortine who lived in rural Ireland many, many years ago. And Gortine had aged into middle age, but had never found love, had never found marriage, much to his disappointment. But he got on with his life living alone. Now, he had a passion for eating mushrooms, and in the autumn of the year, Gortine loved to go out into his fields early in the morning, especially after a damp night, to see what mushrooms had come up overnight. In the Irish language, mushrooms are often called fás éan oíche, the growth of one night. On this morning, in early autumn, Gortine went out into his fields, and the sun was just rising up above the horizon, so there was a low yellow light cast over his fields, and the grass was wet with dew. And Gortine went searching for mushrooms. And every now and again he came across the white disc, and he picked up the mushroom and dropped it into his bag. As he walked across the field, he noticed in the distance something glistening in the damp grass. And he walked towards it, bent down, and lifted up a ball about the size of a tennis ball, but it was golden and glistening and very, very heavy. And he wondered, could it be gold? So he brought the ball to his mouth and sank his teeth into it, and the metal was soft, and he left a mark on it. And he knew then this was a ball of pure gold, which he put in his bag and brought back to his house. When he got home, he looked for a place to hide the golden ball. And in his kitchen, which was the main room of the house, he had a big stone fireplace. So he went and found a loose stone at the back of the fireplace, pulled it out, and made room for the golden ball, which he covered in ashes and soot, and he pushed it back into the hole and replaced the stone again, and nobody would know there was anything there. And he decided, I'll wait, a day will come when I might need that golden ball. 2 or 3 days later, Gortine was outside his house near the road, and he noticed a young woman walking past. She was a stranger to him, he didn't know her, and as she passed, he greeted her. Good morning, he said to her. So she stopped and she answered, good morning, politely. And Gortine said, I don't know you, you're not from around here. She said, no, I'm not. I am on my way to this county of Limerick, she said, which was many miles away. And Gortine asked, why are you going to Limerick? That's a long, long way. Well, she said, I've got a job there with the farmer and his family, and I'm going to tend the house, cook the meals, milk the cows, feed the hens, and look after the house for that family. And Gortine, as I mentioned earlier, was a single man in late middle age, and he saw this attractive young woman and had an appropriate feeling that maybe, he might come up with some ideas. So he said, listen, he said, I could offer you a job here. It would save you the journey going all that distance to Limerick, and I'll pay you the same money, and you'll have your own room. So she agreed, and he brought her into the house, and he showed her around. He showed her where everything was kept, where the food was kept, and he gave her her own room off the kitchen. And she was really pleased. Her name was Mary. And she tended house for him. And she cleaned and she cooked and she washed his clothes and she milked the cows and fed the hens. And Gortine was so happy. And he made a great effort to look well for her. So he changed his shirt maybe 2 times in the week instead of just 1. And he shaved maybe 3 days in the week instead of just 1. And combed his hair in the mornings and made sure when he was eating his meals, he was polite and clean and, did everything almost like a gentleman. Because as the days went by, he was falling in love with Mary. And she worked really hard in the house as well and kept everything clean. Sometimes her behaviour was strange. One day, Gertine came home and Mary was standing on a chair with a stick and she was reaching onto the highest cupboard, poking it like that. And Gertine said, "Come down, Mary, no need to work to that extent. I'm happy with the way you're keeping things." Another day he came home and she was lying flat on the floor and reaching in under the furniture with the brush, poking and brushing. And Gertine said, stand up. We don't need that level of cleanliness here. Take it easy, you're okay. And as I said, Gertine was falling in love. And one day he built up the courage to ask the question. And they were finished their meal in the middle of the day, and Mary was about to clean up, and Gertine said, "Wait a minute, Mary, I've a question to ask you." So she said, "Yes." And he said, "Look, Mary, you've been working here with me now for a couple of weeks, and I'd like to ask you something. Would you marry me?" And Mary said, "Oh, Gertine, thank you so much for asking. You're a gentleman. You treat me well. You're generous and kind, but I have to refuse." And Gertine was so disappointed that he didn't know what to say, so he left the room. But in the following days, he said, "Well, at least Mary knows how I feel, and maybe she might change her mind and come around to my way of thinking." But as the subsequent days went on, as time passed, Gertine noticed that Mary hadn't as much energy for her work. She seemed to be a little weaker every day, and the house wasn't maybe as clean, and she seemed to be sitting a lot and tired. And one morning when Gertine got up, he could see that Mary hadn't got up at all. There was no sign of her in the house, and he wondered where she was. So he went to the door of her room and he knocked gently, but no response. So he knocked a little harder, still no response. So he opened the door a little and said, "Mary, are you all right?" And when he went in, he saw her lying in the bed, very white and breathing in a way that frightened him. So he sent for the doctor to the local village, and the doctor came. And the doctor spent a long time in the room with Mary. And when the doctor came out, he said to Gertine, "Gertine, I'm sorry. I don't know what's wrong with her, but I don't think she has long to live. All you can do is keep her as comfortable as you can." And Gertine did. He tended her as if she was a member of his own family. But 3 days later, she died. And Gertine was very shocked and heartbroken to see that she had died. And he suddenly realised that apart from her name, Mary, he knew nothing else about her, where she was from, who her family were. But he decided he was going to bury her and treat her for her funeral as if she was a member of his own family. So he called the neighbours to help. They cleaned up the house, and Mary was laid out on the table in the traditional fashion in the middle of the kitchen with candles around the table, and she was lying there looking almost angelic on the table. And Gertine brought in food and drink and tobacco for the wake. And he decided that he would wake her for 3 days and 3 nights to show how much he thought of her. And on the first night, a lot of the neighbours called into the house, and they said a prayer over the poor Mary, and they had a drink and a smoke, and they were chatting. And coming up to midnight, it was pitch dark, they heard the galloping of horses in the distance coming towards them. And into the yard came a big black horse, sparks flying from the cobbles in the yard, and a man dressed in black from head to toe, black boots, black hat, black cloak, walked in the door, walked straight up to Mary, where Mary was lying on the table, and he spoke to the dead woman, and he said, "Avurish an rud vi all lorgagut. Did you find what you were looking for?" And her eyes opened, and she said, "Ní vuras," and she closed her eyes again. And everybody in the room was shocked, wondering, was she really dead? Was she coming back to life? And the man turned and stormed out of the room, jumped onto his horse, and galloped off into the night again. And everybody looked and said, "Was that death? Was that the devil? Who was that man?" The word spread. On the second night, there were even more people gathered into the house. And again, they prayed over Mary, and they had a drink and a smoke and a chat. And Gertine was standing by her side the whole night, and a tear trickling down as he looked at her. Coming up to midnight again, the sound of the horses came, and into the yard galloped the big black horse. The man in black jumped down, walked into the room, the crowd parted. He walked to the table where Mary was lying, and he spoke again. Avorish an rud a bhí á lorgagut. Did you find what you were looking for? Again her eyes opened and she said, Ní bhuras. And he turned and out he went. And the news spread throughout the whole parish at the strange goings on in Gertín's house. And on the third night, a huge crowd had gathered into the house, so many that a lot of the people were outside looking in the windows and looking in the doors. And the priest had come as well because he had heard about these strange doings. And as it came to midnight on the third night, they heard the galloping again, louder and louder, the sparks flying, and into the yard came the horse. The man in black again walked through the crowd, separated, and he went to the table and he spoke to the dead woman and he said, Avurish an rud a bhí á lorgagut. Did you find what you were looking for? And again her eyes opened and she said, Ní bhuras, and they closed. And as the man turned to leave, the priest stepped in front of him and said, Stop! And the man stopped and looked down, and the priest said, You've come to this house 3 nights, frightening and terrorizing the people. Explain your behavior. And the man said, I will explain my behavior. He said, I don't come from this world, and neither does Mary. We live in another world, and in the world we live in, we play a ball game like you're hurling, and we play it with a small ball that's made of gold. And Mary's job was to stand by the end of the field, and when the ball went out of play, she was to go and find that ball and bring it back so the game could continue. But the last time we played, the ball went out of play. Mary went to get the ball and she never came back. And I'm going to keep coming back here until I get that ball. And the priest said, That's the most ridiculous story I ever heard. Tell the truth. And with that, Gertín said, I think I can explain. And everybody turned to Gertín. And he went to the fireplace. He loosened the stone, reached in and took out the ball. He wiped the soot and the ashes from the ball and he held it out. And it glistened in the light of the candle. And everybody in the room fell silent and they were staring. And the man took the ball from him and put it in his pocket. And he reached his hand out to Mary lying on the table and he said, Tarlum, come with me. And with that, her eyes opened. She sat up and climbed down from the table. And the man took her by the hand and led her towards the door. And the crowd separated to let them out. And just as they were leaving, the girl hesitated and she looked back to Gertín and she said, Gertín, some weeks back you asked me a question. Would you like to ask that question again? And Gertín turned to her and he said, Mary, would you like to marry me? And she said, I would. And with that, Gertín reached out his hand to her and Mary reached to him. And when their hands touched, whatever hold that man had over her was broken. And he left. And Gertín and Mary were left there standing in the middle of the floor, holding each other's hands. And the galloping horse went off into the night and wasn't seen anymore. And everybody looked and wondered what had happened. The priest spoke up and he said, I'm the priest of this parish, he said, and I can see that these 2 people are in love with each other. I will marry them tonight, he said, because the neighbours are gathered and the house is full of food and drink. And he married the 2 of them that night, and the party with the neighbours and friends went on for 3 days and 3 nights. And Gertín and Mary lived a long and happy life. They had children, they had grandchildren, and their grandchildren had children. And it was one of those great grandchildren that told me that story.
The story we heard and the stories we will hear deal with these perennial concerns of death and fate, which are common in Irish storytelling tradition as well as in many cultures around the world. Samhain is the time of year when the other world is closer to us. The dead are more present, the sheaths are open. It's possible to glimpse behind the curtain to see the machinations of fate. Sometimes humanity can prevail in these clashes when our world butts up against the next. In the tale of the golden ball, which we've heard, the mysterious woman is brought back from the dead. People kidnapped by the fair folk and maybe recovered, and the changeling left in their place brought back. Premonitions and warnings may be heeded and disaster averted, as Nera did when he learned of the destruction of Rath Cruachan. More often than not, this is not the case, however. The motif of the self-fulfilling prophecy is found across the world, going back again to ancient Greece, in the tale of Oedipus that'll be well known to many of you. Laius, the king of Thebes, fears the prophecy of his son killing him, and thus exposes his son. As a result of this, when Oedipus returns to Thebes, Laius is no more than a stranger that he has no qualms about killing. In the tale ATU 410, better known to us as Sleeping Beauty, the concerned parents have heard that their daughter will die when she pricks her finger on a spindle, and terrified, they have every single spindle in the kingdom destroyed, until one day she sees one, and consumed by curiosity about this thing that she's never seen before, she touches it. Without giving too much away, the next two tales likewise relate to the inevitability of death. The first is an ancient story about death in the marketplace, and one that goes back at least as far back as the Babylonian Talmud, although it's very, very popular in Ireland, as it turns out, with the exotic locations such as Samarra and Baghdad replaced by more familiar ones such as Cork and Galway. The second one has a happy ending, but reinforces these points about death and inevitability, as well as a more overtly Christian moral about good deeds and piety. Since we're here in Sweden, or at least some of us are, it seems appropriate to discuss an element of folk belief that's shared in both the Nordic and the Gaelic worlds, the idea of the Fodsin Wash, or the Bana Thufa, the sod of death. There's a predestined spot of earth where one will die, and there are all sorts of legends about attempts to counteract this, to prevent this fated death from happening. And ironically, this causes this to happen, or causes it to happen earlier than it might. And these stories are quite old, as it turns out. We find examples of them in Manas O'Donnell's Life of Colm Killia from the 16th century, for example. And there's accounts in the 19th and 20th centuries, this sort of belief being used as a consolation. This tragedy was fated. There's nothing that could have been done otherwise. As Ireland is an island, the notion of fated death is very often tied up with water, river crossings, and drownings. Sometimes this death, this predestined death, is personified, and we find tales of mermaids and related beings. Likewise, in Sweden, we have the Näcken and the Bäckhäst, the Nixie, perhaps, and the water horse. In the Highlands of Scotland, we find the Vow, the mermaid who drowns people at the spot where they're destined to die. And in this word vow, we can perhaps see a reflexive Badv, the Old Irish, the goddess of death to the medieval Irish. Death appears in our stories in a variety of other ways. The man in black, the ghostly hound, and perhaps most well known, the Banshee, the woman of the sheaf. She is a messenger rather than the cause of death. She appears to presage it, to give warning of it, to the one who's going to die, as well as to their relations and their friends, rather than causing it herself. She's said to cry, and in Irish the terms are clean or gull for the dead. And her appearance most often resembles that of the traditional type of mourning that was done by women. Her hair is unbound, her clothing is torn apart, and her face is distorted with tears. Sometimes, especially in Scotland, she appears as a woman washing the bloody clothes of the dead man in the river. And some accounts connect her with the mourning, say that she mourns especially the head of the family. And there's a tradition that she only mourns Irish families, sometimes said to be those with a Mac or an O in their name. Perhaps a connection or a distant memory of an older aristocratic belief in ancestral or patron goddesses. Death can, of course, come at any time of the year, and so these manifestations of deathly messengers, deathly omens, are not limited to any one festival. They're certainly not limited to Samhain or Bealtaine, but the presence of the dead is more closely felt at this time of the year. And these customs that we have, these serve as a reflection or an invitation to reflect on a relationship with the next world. And one way to do so, of course, is by telling stories of our encounters with that world, encounters with the sheath, encounters with walking dead, the unquiet dead, attempts to wrest loved ones, dear ones back from the power of the dead, more often than not unsuccessful. But it's an invitation to story, to tell stories, to reflect upon them and what they mean for us. And with that, I'll turn ourselves over to Dermot again for the last two stories.
Thank you, Greg. One morning, a master sent his servant boy to the local market here in Cork to buy food and provisions for the day, because at that time you bought your food in the town every day, no way to keep it fresh otherwise. And when the boy went to the market was crowded with people, pushing and shoving and trying to get the best products for themselves. And as the boy was making his way through the crowd, he noticed a tall man amongst the people, standing a little taller than everybody else, and again dressed strangely, mostly in black. And the man was scanning the crowd as he looked above them. And suddenly his gaze fell on the servant boy. And the servant boy looked at him, and the man seemed to be taken aback and looked strangely at the servant boy. And the boy was taken aback too to see this man looking at him. And he took fright and he ran from the marketplace. And he ran home to his master. And the master said, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And the boy could hardly get the words out. He said, "I've been to the market," he said, and I have to go away. "Go away," said the master. "Why do you need to go away?" "Because I've seen death in the market, and he looked at me, and he looked at me strangely, and from the way he looked at me, I have a feeling that he's come to get me, so I must get away before he can take me." And the man said, "Well, where can you go?" And he said, "I have friends in Galway," he said, "and if you lend me a horse, I can go to Galway, and I'll be safe there." And the man said, "But that's a whole day's ride away. You won't be there until evening." "I know," said the boy, "but if I go now, I'll get away." So the master agreed, and they went out and they saddled up the horse, and he put the boy on the horse, and the boy galloped out of the yard, out of the city of Cork, and headed northwestwards towards Galway. And the master reflected on what had happened and thought about it, and he said, "This is very strange." So he went to the market to investigate, to see if he could find this man, this death that the boy was so frightened of. And when he went to the market, it was just as busy as it had been earlier. People pushing and shoving and crowding around and so on. And after a while, he did notice this taller man standing up, scanning the crowd again. And he went towards him and tapped him on the arm and said, "Excuse me." And the man turned to him and said, "Yes." And the master said, "You frightened my servant boy earlier here. Please explain yourself. He's scared to death almost. What's this about?" And the man said, "Well," he said, "yes, I was very shocked to see him here. I am Death, and I was very surprised to see him here today, because I have an appointment to see him this evening in Galway." Short, hopefully scary. This one, not so scary, and maybe not so short either. There was a man one time in Ireland, and his name was Untitled, which translates as the gambler or the card player. And he played cards every chance he got, with his friends, with his neighbours, with strangers. Every evening he was gone from home playing cards. And invariably he lost. So he was a very poor man, and his wife as well was very poor and often very angry with him for that. But one evening he came home from playing at cards and from losing at cards, and he met a neighbouring woman at the door of his house, and she said, "Your wife is after giving birth to a baby. Go and get the priest and get godparents, and we'll baptise the child." Because in those days, as soon as a child was born, he was baptized as quickly, or she was baptized as quickly as possible in case they died. So the Caruach turned around and headed off to find the priest and find godparents. The first man he met on the road was God himself. And God spoke to the Caruach and said, "You've had a child." "I have," said the Caruach. "Well," said God, "I'd like to offer my services as godfather to your child." And the Caruach thought for a second and said, "No, thank you. I don't want you as godfather to my child." And God was taken aback and said, "Why not?" Well, he said, "You are not very fair. I see some of my neighbours doing very well, enjoying success, getting wealthy, and I'm poor. You're not fair. So no, I refuse your offer." And God was, but he went on his way. On went the Caruach. A little while later, he met another man. And this man stopped him and said, "Ha, Caruach, I hear you've had a child. I'd like to offer my services as godfather." And the Caruach said, "And who are you?" And the man said, "I am Death." And the Caruach thought for a minute and said, "Yes, I will accept you as a godfather for my child, because you're the fairest of all. Powerful or weak, rich or poor, you take everybody in the end. That's very fair. I accept that." And then Death said to him, "Now, if I was you, I'd go after God again and ask him to tell him that you've change your mind that you want him as the second godparent because, he would be a good person to have as a godparent. So the Caruach did. He found God on the road again and said, I've changed my mind. I want you to be a godparent to my child. And God accepted. God is very forgiving in these situations, if you ever come across him in that way. And word got to the priest as well. And within a few hours, the priest, God, and Death, and some of the neighbours were gathered in the house, and the child, the newly born child, was baptized. And as the people were chatting, Death called the Caruach to one side and he said, after a baptism like this, you can ask God for some favours, some wishes. So go ask him for something. He'll give it to you. So the Caruach went to God and said, excuse me, I'd like to ask for a wish. And God said, of course. What would you like? And the Caruach thought for a minute and he said, I'd like to be able to win at cards all the time, to beat everybody. And God said, granted. And Death called the Caruach over and said, what did you ask for? And the Caruach said, I asked for the beating of everybody at cards. Okay, said Death, I think you should go and ask for another wish. So the Caruach went back and said, excuse me, and God turned and he said, could I have a second wish? Of course, said God. What would you like? And the Caruach thought for a second and said, I'd like to be able to cure any sick person, to be better than all the good doctors, the best doctors in the world. Not a problem, said God. Your wish is granted. And the Caruach was very pleased. And Death called him over again and said, what did you ask for this time? And the Caruach said, I asked to be able to cure people who were sick or dying and all. And Death said, stop. I don't like that. Look, he said, if you ever go to cure somebody, and if you find me standing at the end of the bed, that means you cannot cure that person. They're mine. But if I'm standing at the head of the bed, it means it's fine to take that person. Thank you, said the Caruach. And then Death said, I think you should ask for a third wish because God will give you the third wish. So the Caruach went back, tapped God on the shoulder, and God turned around and said, yes. And the Caruach said, can I have a third wish? And God said, it's the baptism of your child. I'm the godparent. I can give you this third and final wish. But be careful what you choose, said God. And the Caruach thought for a while, and he remembered a lovely apple tree he had in his garden that produced the juiciest, the reddest, and the finest of apples. But every autumn, when the apples were ripe, the local children would come and steal the apples from his tree. So he said to God, God, what I want is that nobody can take an apple from my tree. And if they touch those apples, their hand will be stuck to that apple until I release them. Granted, said God. And the Death called the Caruach over and said, what did you ask for your third wish? And the Caruach said, I'm not going to tell you. And Death said, all right. And the party broke up and everybody went home. God went back to his heavenly home. Death went off about his business and life carried on. The Caruach began playing cards again, but this time when he played cards, he won every time. And he was able to do very clever shuffles with the cards. And he became so expert that he won every single game. And within a matter of a few weeks, nobody would play with him because the word had spread and they knew he was unbeatable. So then he decided he would try exercising his abilities as a cure-all doctor. So whenever he heard of somebody who was very ill in the area, he went and offered his services. And they accepted, and it worked every time. And one day the Caruach heard that a very wealthy man not too far away was very ill and near death, and that all of the doctors in the area had come and had failed, and that he was bound to die. So the Caruach went to that house and knocked on the door. The woman of the house opened the door and said, yes. And the Caruach said, I'd like to cure your husband. I hear he is near death. Oh, she said, it is a waste of time. All the best doctors have come. They've tried their best. They've all failed. He's nearly dead already. Well, said the Caruach, if I cure him, will you give me a chest of gold and silver? And she said, I'll give you all the money that we have. So the Caruach went in and she led him to the bedroom. And there was the old man lying in his bed, and he was near death. And the family and friends were gathered round. But as the Caruach approached the bed, he saw that standing at the end of the bed was Death. And Death was looking at the Caruach, and he was shaking his head, meaning the Caruach couldn't cure him. So the Caruach thought for a minute, whispered in the ear of 4 young, strong men who were there. And on the click of his finger, the 4 men rushed to the 4 corners of the bed, lifted it up and turned it 180 degrees around so that Death was now standing at the head of the bed. And the Caruach went in and laid his hands on the man and cured him. This angered Death. And he said to the Caruach, you have beaten me, but you won't beat me again. I'll be back. Death left, and the Caruach was given his reward, more wealth than he would ever spend. 7 years later, the Caruach was going about his business, and Death came to visit. And the Caruach was counting his money, and he had a candle lighting on the table by his side as he counted his money. And Death said, "You have to come with me now. You got your 7 years after beating me." And the Caruach said, "Well, I'll come with you when this candle has burnt down." And Death said, "Okay." And then the Caruach went, and he said, "That's a candle I will never light again." So he fooled Death again. And Death again was angry and said, "I'll be back. I'll be back. I'll get you the next time," he said. And Death left. And the Caruach carried on, living life, and he was happy enough. But 7 years later, Death appeared again at his home, and he said, "Right, I've come for you this time. No candles, no tricks." "No tricks," said the Caruach. "I'm happy to go. I'll pack my things. I believe the journey to hell is long." And Death said, "Get on with it." And the Caruach said, "Listen, it's a long journey. We'll be hungry. Go out to my garden. It's autumn. The tree is full of ripe apples. Pick some apples and they'll sustain us on the journey. I'll pack my bag. When you have the apples, we'll go." Death went into the garden and reached up for the juiciest, shiniest apple, put his hand on it, but his hand was stuck. He couldn't move it. He couldn't pull the apple. He reached with his second hand to another apple, and his 2 hands were stuck to the apples, and he was hanging from the tree like this, and he couldn't get himself free. And he started shouting, and the Caruach came out and said, "Yes." And Death said, "Please, free me. I'm stuck here. I can't let go." And the Caruach said, "I don't think I will." "Please," he said, "please, I'll give you a long number of years if you let me go." And in the end, the Caruach let him go. And Death went off angry with his hands. And the Caruach forgot about him and lived on his life happily. And he was getting old at this stage. And one day, the Caruach was getting old at this stage. And Death, of course, came back to visit him again. And the Caruach at this stage said, "You're back again?" And Death said, "Look, you're not going to escape me all the time. Come with me." And the Caruach said, "Please, not now. You must come." He said, You've got the better of me. You've beaten me on a number of occasions. You must come this time. You have no tricks left." And the Caruach said, "Well, before I leave, please let me say one prayer. Let me say the Lord's Prayer, and then I'll go with you." And Death said, "Say your prayer." And the Caruach joined his hands, took a deep breath, and said, "That's a prayer I'll never say." And Death realized again that he couldn't take him, that he had made a deal, and the Caruach had fooled him. And he was angry and left. And the Caruach was so happy with himself now. And the years went by. And one day, Caruach was walking, and he was passing the local church. And there was a small village school next to the church. And outside the walls of the church and school was a small boy sitting on the ground, and he was crying and sobbing. And the Caruach took pity on him and went to the boy and said, "What's wrong? Why are you crying? Why are you so sad?" And the boy said, "The priest won't let me make my first Holy Communion." And the Caruach said, "Why not?" "Because I can't learn or say my prayer. I just can't do it. I can't learn it. I can't say it." And the Caruach said, "What prayer?" Well, he said, "The Lord's Prayer." And the Caruach said, "It's a very simple prayer. I'll say it for you. You repeat after me, and then you'll know it." And the boy said, "Okay." And the Caruach started, "Or nahar a toir nav, go nefer tanim, go dagad the reef, go nainter the hodder and dal of marienter and nav," right through to the end. And then he looked at the boy. The boy, when he finished the prayer, the boy stood up, and suddenly he wasn't a boy anymore. he turned into death. Ha ha, he said, you've said the prayer, I have you now. And he grabbed the Caruach by the throat and said, you're coming with me this time. No deals, no tricks. And off he took him, down to the depths of hell. And when they got to the gates of hell, the door, death knocked at the door. And the devil opened the door and pushed the Caruach in. And in went the Caruach to hell. But he had his cards with him. And every evening he played cards with all those evil people in hell, all those devils, senior and minor devils, Lucifer and the rest of them. But of course, he won at cards every time. And in the end, Lucifer came, the chief devil, and said to the Caruach, we've had enough. And he brought him to the doors of hell and threw him out. And the Caruach staggered out and said, where do I go now? So up he went to heaven, and he went to the gates of heaven, and he knocked at the door, and he waited. And eventually the door opened, and St. Peter appeared. Yes, said St. Peter. And the Caruach said, please let me in, they won't take me in hell. And he said, who are you? And the Caruach said, I'm the Caruach. One moment, said Peter, until I check the books. And he opened big books, and he went through checking and going through the pages, and he said, ha, Caruach. No, he said, you had many opportunities to save your soul. God gave you wishes, and at no stage would you choose to save your soul. I'm afraid you can't get in. And he slammed the book shut. And the Caruach began shouting, please, you must let me in, let me in. And with that, God appeared behind St. Peter and said, what's all this noise? And Peter turned to God and said, this is the Caruach, he's trying to get in here, but I explained. He had a chance to save his soul and didn't take it. He'll have to go. And God said, let me speak. And God thought for a minute and said, yeah, you did have your chance to save your soul, and you were greedy, and you weren't very attentive to your wife or your child, and all you wanted was wealth. But on one occasion, you did show great concern and goodness. When you saw what you thought was a small little boy crying who couldn't learn his prayer, you took the time to try and teach him that, even though it went against you. That outweighs all the wrong you have done. You can come into heaven. The Caruach was delighted, and just as he went to cross the threshold, God stopped him and said, stop. No cards in here. Leave them outside. So the Caruach threw the cards to the ground outside, and in he went. And ever since then, anybody entering the gates of heaven, if they look down to the left, they'll see scattered on the ground the cards that the Caruach had to leave behind him. Shine Mushgale, Gurmahagwef.
Wow, Dermot, August Greg, Mila Week's feature Shin Arouse or Fod. That was an absolutely wonderful few minutes there. So engaging. We're seeing messages coming in from all over the world here, actually, would you believe?
Well,
we've had messages from the length and breadth of Sweden, and I can tell you it's a very long country, so that's a good sign. From Ireland, of course, and even from further afield in Spain and the whole way across the Atlantic in Chicago, the United States. So we're doing very, very well. Thank you both so much. It was absolutely fantastic. We put the call out in case there were any questions. We've just had one in from Bridget. I think it's for you, Greg. To the pronunciation of SIDHE, could you just go through, could you explain that one again and let us know what that one is?
SIDHE. Yeah. This is, so Irish has cases much like Latin and Greek. So she would be how it's pronounced. In earlier Irish, she, the, but we lose the DH sound to the sound because, like we do in Irish English, we don't pronounce that anymore. And this is the genitive of sheath, which is both the hill and the people who live in it, the gentry, the fair folk. So a banshee is a woman of the she, a woman who's from that sort, you can say.
Ah, fantastic. Okay, it's interesting to hear the etymology, I suppose, and how it presents in various different forms. I put out one more call if anybody has another question for our fantastic panelists. We've got fantastic messages in from all over the world. Great storytelling, really enjoying it. Gothenburg, Uppsala, Kalmar, and other places with various Swedish letters that are quite difficult to pronounce. So, I'll just say thank you both again so much for joining us this evening, and to all our guests from all around the world. It's been a great evening of storytelling and folklore. and I suppose getting us in the mood for Halloween and Samhain and the festival where the what do they call it, the veil between the worlds is slightly thinner. So listen, gur míle mágwibh, thank you so much. Agus bíag ia jasagwibh. Enjoy your evening, everybody. Taxi at
Thanks, Mika.
Bye.